Hello, and thank you for joining me. We've got a great one for you today for anyone who has wanted to make amazing bread with a recipe that is open to endless variation. We are talking homemade focaccia. And what's even better is that we have my talented Italian baker and pastry chef friend here to guide us every step of the way and to show us that the whole process is much easier than you might think. But before we get started, a few words to introduce my friend. This is Laura. We met when we worked together at the same restaurant in Copenhagen, and it became very obvious to me right away that she was not only very skilled at what she did, but that she also cared a lot about what she did. Her primary specialty when I met her was bread with an emphasis on sourdough, but now she has moved on to a new job where in almost no time at all she has also become skilled in the art of laminated pastries like croissants. Is there anything she can't do? 7 years younger than myself and already with a very formidable set of skills in her repertoire, I am excited to watch, forgive the bread pun, the rise of her career going forward. But if you need more proof, come see what we make together in my kitchen. And just so you know, there will be a full recipe breakdown in the description. So, getting into it, today we are making 2 different focaccias. One large savory, perhaps the most classic flavor, tomato, and also a sweet variation with blackberries and mascarpone. Not as many people know about sweet variations of focaccia, but they are amazing, so we felt it would be great to showcase one here. The dough is the same in both cases, so there is no need for extra recipes. The process will follow like this. First, I will make a poulish, then we will make one large batch of dough. That dough will be folded and rested, and then we will divide and shape the dough for our 2 variations. We will make our bread topping, and lastly, of course, we will bake the focaccia. First, let's put together our poulish, which is easy even if you don't know what the word means. It is just a measured amount of flour, water, and yeast that has been mixed together and allowed to ferment before the bread dough is put together. So I get my scale out and measure out 6 grams of the fresh yeast, half that if you are using active dry yeast. Then I add 300 grams of water, a little bit warmer than room temperature. Now I just mix that up with my hand to make sure the yeast is completely dissolved. And then I go in with my strong bread flour, which will be the same weight as my water. That is 300 grams. Now I just mix that up until everything has gone pretty smooth. Now that our poulish is all mixed up, we need to transfer it to container to grow and ferment. If using a jar, it should be big enough so that the poulish can triple in size. I realized after putting it in this glass container that it wouldn't be quite big enough, so I ended up just going with a big bowl, which is also fine. Now I just cover that with a damp towel or some plastic wrap and let it go at room temperature for about 3 hours. The poulish gives great levity to our bread and also contributes to the depth of flavor. And after 3 hours, just in time for Laura's arrival, this is what it looks like. It has clearly expanded greatly, and at the surface, aside from the air pockets, you can also see some wrinkles forming. That means we are ready to put our dough together. And let's talk about flour. Focaccia is very forgiving and versatile. So you could get away with using just one kind of flour, like all-purpose or bread flour, but if you already have more than one flour on hand, using a variety can lend your bread some character. And so for our recipe, we are using 300 grams of all-purpose flour, 280 grams of Manitoba flour, which is like a strong bread flour, and for personality, we are adding 60 grams of spelt flour. We just measure that out into a bowl. And even though there is yeast in our poulish, we are also going to use some more here in the dough, so Laura is measuring out 6 grams of fresh yeast. She is also separately measuring out the salt, 12 grams that is. And we also measure out our water, which, just like with the poulish, we want to be slightly warmer than room temperature. And for our recipe, that is 360 grams. And now, with everything measured, we are ready to mix, and even though I have a stand mixer, Laura said we should use a bowl so people can see you really don't need any special equipment to make great bread. And I didn't even have a big enough bowl, so we just ended up using the base of my Dutch oven instead. First, our flour goes into the bowl, along with our lively poulish. Laura wets the wooden spoon we are using so that our mix doesn't stick to it that much. Next, Laura dissolves the measured yeast in most of the 360 grams of water that we measured. She leaves out some water because she wants to have a little bit later when we add the salt to the dough. At that point, it will help the salt dissolve better. With the yeast dissolved in the water, she now adds it to the mix of flour and poolish and begins the mixing process, which is steady and consistent. She starts by mixing everything with the wooden spoon. After a few minutes of mixing, once the flour, water, and poolish have become one cohesive mass, Laura cleans off the wooden spoon and continues with her hands, using the classic hand kneading movements while continuously rotating the bowl with the other hand. Here you can see the motion from overhead. While hand kneading doesn't work the dough as intensely as a mixer would, Laura explains that we will use time as a machine, meaning that the resting time that we will give our dough will allow for further gluten development. Once Laura can feel that the dough has developed some level of gluten, she can determine this by the resistance that the dough puts up when kneading. She knows that it is a good time to add the salt, and the last little splash of water which helps that salt dissolve. Salt is added a little later in the kneading process because it can actually inhibit the development of gluten, especially in the early stages of mixing. So generally it is always best to add the salt once some level of resistance has been achieved in the dough. This rule holds true for most bread recipes. With the salt fully incorporated into the dough and a baseline of a gluten network established, Laura cleans her hands. We cover the dough with a damp towel or plastic wrap, and then we set a timer for just 10 minutes. And after just 10 minutes, it's time for a fold. And even though it looks as though no change has taken place, when Laura wets her hands and goes to make a few coil folds, we can see that the dough has indeed changed dramatically. It is much more smooth and elastic, and once folded, retains its rounded shape. With the fold complete, the dough is covered again and rested for another 20 minutes. And we can use this time to put some olive oil in the pans we will be doing our final proofing in. For the smaller sweet focaccia, I am generously oiling this metal rectangular baking tray, and for our large focaccia, we will be proofing in the same bowl we mixed in, so we will also hit that with some olive oil. And you may have noticed that we didn't include any olive oil in our actual dough. Laura said that this is a bit unusual, but that she generally prefers to have the oil on the outside of the dough as opposed to the inside. And after the 20-minute rest is up, it's time to divide our dough, and for that, it's best to have a bench scraper, so go out and buy one, or
so steal it in a bakery.
Steal from your baker friend. Either way, we just divide up our dough, giving ourselves 900 grams for our larger focaccia, which should leave around 700 grams for our smaller focaccia. With the dough divided, Laura just finishes up by shaping the dough slightly, which she makes look so easy. If you struggle with this step, you might find it helpful to use the bench scraper instead of your hands. Once shaped, she transfers the smaller dough to the rectangular pan and the larger dough to the mixing bowl. And then we cover them once more and let them proof, this time setting our timer for 1 hour. After 1 hour, we took a look at our dough, and with Laura's expert eye, she determined that we were not quite there yet. So we set a timer for 20 more minutes. We just needed that dough to be a little more puffy. In the meantime, we set our oven to 200 degrees Celsius or 400 degrees Fahrenheit about, and got to work on our toppings. I've got a bunch of nice colorful cherry tomatoes here, and I just set about to cutting them all in half. Some of the smaller ones I just left whole. Once cut up, I get them in a bowl and give them a good pinch of salt and crush them up with my hands, going pretty aggressively because we really want to release those juices. And you really know Laura is Italian because she brought her own oregano, just like the kind that Lydia Bastianich likes to use. We just get a bit of that oregano into our tomato mix. And for our sweet focaccia, we have some wonderful blackberries here. We got those in a bowl and just added a bit of sugar. And for some herbaceousness, we also are adding some thyme leaves. And it won't hurt with some classic baking spices either, so we have here some cinnamon and a little bit of cardamom. And just like those tomatoes, we want to get those good and crushed, and your hand is probably the best tool for that job, even if it stains your palms a little bit. And now back to our dough. After about 25 more minutes, our dough was looking more like it was supposed to. See how it has really puffed up and looks taut and inflated? So now we are ready for shaping. For the big bread, we are baking on one of those trays that comes with the oven. And we've just got a piece of parchment paper down and a generous glug of olive oil. With our landing zone ready, Laura lifts out the big dough and sets it on the tray. And then she starts shaping. Using her hands with fingers spread out, she pokes indentations into the dough all over. Don't be afraid here. The pockets are what make this bread so iconic. With the dough poked, Laura moves on to stretching and pulling it out a bit to give it a larger area. But don't stretch too much. Keep an eye on the thickness. Ours was at about 1.5 inches or about 4 centimeters. And once she had it stretched, Laura went back for one more round of poking the dough and a few gentle tugs at the corners. Then we were ready for our tomatoes. And there is no reason to be shy here. Laura is going for pretty full coverage. And once the tomatoes are on, she goes through and actually presses on the tomatoes a bit so that they sink into the dough. And then, as a final step, she pokes the dough one last time to make sure there are some pockets for all that beautiful tomato liquid that was left behind in the bowl. Waste nothing. Now all that is left to do is give the top a nice drizzle of olive oil. Like I said, there is no olive oil in the dough itself, but we are making up for that in the amount that we use everywhere else. On to the shaping of our sweet focaccia. The process is the same. She pokes at the dough with her fingers and gently pulls on the corners and sides of the dough a bit to stretch it out a bit thinner and to make sure it fits the pan. Now it's ready for our topping. We go all over with our crushed berries, and then Laura pokes at the dough again, forcing some of those berries into the pockets, and then we drizzle on the juices left over in our bowl. And even though this is a sweet focaccia, we still want to drizzle a bit of olive oil over it. Oof! You've got to admit that this is looking pretty good already. And now we are ready for the oven. We open up the oven and place the bigger tomato focaccia more towards the bottom and the blackberry focaccia more on the top half of the oven. Once closed up, we set our timer for 10 minutes, though we might, and in fact did, need more time. And here we need to talk a bit about ovens and adjusting to your own situation. All ovens are different. I have a decent, modern oven with a fan, but even so, it struggles with bread. After 10 minutes, we checked in on the focaccia. The blackberry one was coming along fine, but the bottom one was still very pale on the top. Yet, when we lift the bread up and glance underneath, we seem to be getting good color there. We actually ended up cooking the blackberry focaccia for another 10 minutes, and the tomato focaccia for another 15 minutes. And we even set the oven to the broil function because once it was cooked, we still wanted the top to have a little more color. The moral of the story is don't panic if your focaccia isn't done in 10 to 15 minutes. Don't be afraid to crank the heat up a little bit or give it some extra time if it needs it. When it is fully cooked, it will seem a bit rigid, as you can see here when we remove it from the trays, but in just a short amount of time resting out of the oven, they will soften and have a more pliable texture. And despite our oven struggles, we were pretty happy with our final results, and I was getting pretty hungry. As one final touch for the tomato focaccia, we just gave it a good brush with some more of that olive oil. And for the blackberry focaccia, I took some mascarpone cheese and added dollops all over. And we had a few berries left over that didn't get used on the top of the bread before the baking, so I added them now. I thought it would be nice with the contrast of the cooked and the raw. And if that wasn't enough, I also grated some fresh lemon zest all over to keep things light and lively. And as a final touch, I added a good sprinkle of this decorative sugar that is readily available in the grocery stores here in Denmark. It just helps everything sparkle a bit. The only thing left to do now is cut them up and serve, and that is exactly what I did. Once cut, you can really see the impressive network of air pockets within the bread. And I love how the indentations we made in the dough give the bread such textural variety. You have the crispy edges, yet you also can get bites that are borderline gooey from the concentration of the toppings in those pockets. So good. And the berry one is definitely not overly sweet at all. So there you have it. 2 beautiful focaccias from one dough. a classic tomato and oregano, and a sweet blackberry focaccia with creamy mascarpone. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this look at the focaccia making process with my talented friend, and I hope it gives you confidence to try it yourself. And as you saw with the blackberry focaccia, you really don't have to limit yourself to the classic savory flavors. Use the seasons as your guide, and I'm sure you can come up with your own unique combination. If you liked this video, hitting the like button is a simple way to show it, and don't forget to subscribe while you are at it. I've got a lot of great videos in my collection and even more to come, so it would be great to have you along for the ride. And don't ever hesitate to ask questions or say what's on your mind in the comments. And of course, a big thank you to Laura for baking with me and always being there when I need bread and pastry advice. You are a true talent. You can follow her on Instagram to see some of her amazing work, and if you speak Italian, you can even listen to a bread-based podcast she does with some colleagues of hers. And maybe one day she will let us come to the bake shop and show us how to make croissants. Only time will tell. Until next time, cheers!